Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Roberts, Curator of Programming at Planet Word. Welcome to tonight's presentation of Language and Gender. This is part of our monthly series, Language and, which explores the intersection of language and kind of anything you can imagine. That's why language is so cool. It intersects with every discipline out there. This is a series that's made possible by the generous support of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation, and of course from membership support from folks like you. So if you are already a member of Planet Word, thank you very much for that. It's how we're able to keep admission to the museum free, do programming like this. If you are not yet a member or you found out about this program through a friend, we would love to have you join us. If you follow us on social media or go to planetwordmuseum.org and sign up for our newsletter, that's the best way to know what's coming up. I will tell you our next Language and episode in June is about language and taxonomy, about how animal species get named. If you've ever wondered about that, it is wild. And that conversation will involve everything from DNA analysis and habitat destruction to elitism and classism and 17th century Dutch biologists. So take a look at our schedule coming up. We've got a lot of great programs. Our guest tonight is Amanda Montell. You might remember her if you joined us for a conversation about her book, Cultish. But before she wrote Cultish, about the language of cult, she wrote Wordslut about language and gender. And we are delighted to have her back. Amanda Montell, linguist and writer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I should say from the outset that the subtitle of Wordslut is A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language. So this is not just observing gender in language. It is with the intent of rectifying the bias of gender in language.
Yeah, I think there's some activism in there. You know, I want people to leave the book feeling empowered with a set of knowledge and tools.
And knowledge and tools to do what exactly?
Knowledge and tools to be able to, I guess, oh my God, it just occurred to me that I haven't spoken about Wordslut in so long. I was like, what is this book about? No, I remember.
Goodness, otherwise it would be a really long hour.
No, I recall. Sorry, I got distracted by the program that you were announcing for next time about taxonomy, which sounds so interesting. And I was like, in a way, this is also a book about language and taxonomy. It's how we come up with the language that we use to describe ourselves and our genders, you know, which is a sort of like classification system. Sometimes it's a grammatical classification system, gender. Anyway, yeah, I set out to sort of like share my linguistics acumen, which I had gained in a sort of exclusive academic setting that wasn't super accessible or even interesting to an everyday person. Linguistics, that term, probably not to the audience here, but but to an everyday reader is sort of an alienating word. And I'll tell you, when I first pitched this book around to publishers, it had a different title. Titling this book was very challenging. And the original title was We Should All Be Linguists, which was problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, you have to know so many references in order to like understand that title. It's derivative, obviously, and on purpose from the book We Should All Be Feminists. But the feedback that I got from every publisher that I met with was like, we're trying to make linguistics cool and empowering for someone who has never even heard of this field of study potentially. And the word linguistics at first blush, I mean, maybe some people attending can attest, people think it means you're a grammarian or it means you like study elocution or you're like a prescriptivist, but they don't even know, like the average person doesn't even know what prescriptivism is. So they were like, we got to strip linguistics from the title of this book and make it like real grabby. And that was kind of the entire intention behind the book. Like every chapter in the book has a clickbait structured title, you know, titles like Women Didn't Ruin the English Language, They like invented it, or How to Embarrass the Shit Out of People Who Try to Correct Your Grammar, or Time to Make This Book Just a Little Bit Gayer. Like they're really sort of a comment on and play on the internet writing that I had been doing up until I set out to write this book. I was literally writing for a beauty magazine where I would pen listicles by the dozen, like 10 lipsticks to buy in May or whatever. And so I was taking this sort of really populist, like really base headline structure, and I was applying it to the subject matter that might seem like on a high pedestal of academia and really inaccessible to an everyday person. Little did they know that like language affects everyone, especially with regard to gender, in a really material, political way. And so I wanted, marginalized folks, marginalized genders in particular, because that's the focus here, to be able to learn, like, this is why critiques of the way that you speak are invalid or based on prejudice or based in linguistic objectification. This is like a study supporting why you've always felt frustrated by being called insert gendered insult here. And, every chapter of the book tackles a different sort of subject in the overall like massive canon of language and gender research. But I was really hoping to be able to put empirical studies to the sort of intuitive frustrations and curiosities, because there's a lot of joy in this book as well, in addition to like the dismantling. I wanted to be able to like put studies and labels and and real like concrete examples behind questions and frustrations that people who hold marginalized gender identities have always felt. And it's really funny because I'll run into readers now, or I'll meet readers now who will tell me everything from like, thank you so much for like making this accessible so that I could understand it. I'd always felt really alienated or otherized by being called X, Y, and Z gendered insult, or like this book allowed me to open up a conversation about grammatical gender with my parents who just really don't understand gender neutral pronouns. Or this book, I've had this happen a few times. I've had women tell me this book made me realize truly how bigoted my cis male partner was, and we're no longer together.
Oh no.
Like they're like, I'm so happy now. So
wow, that's a powerful book.
Yeah, right. But it's just a little linguistics book with a sweet yellow cover, but it's had a sort of material effect on people's personal lives, also their professional lives. I'm often asked questions with regard to like, I work in a predominantly male environment where I'm critiqued for the way that I speak, my overuse of hedges or the word like or upspeak, how can I reckon with that criticism in this male dominated space? And I've, come up with some tokens of wisdom and empowerment that I try to leave people with. But I suppose it's kind of a scattered answer to a pretty simple question. Language and linguistics can be so materially empowering.
Well, for an audience that doesn't necessarily shy away from the, real social science of linguistics, how mature is this field of language and gender?
Not especially. It really emerged with second wave feminism in the 70s. That's when people started really taking a formal look at the relationship between language and gender expectations, gender identity. How do we define gender in the first place? How do we distinguish it from sex? There is a chapter in the book that really talks about the taxonomy, if you will, of human gender versus sex and how our language reflects and conflates the two, and how those things show up in the way that we speak every day. But yeah, this field really started, the most famous name from that era in this field was probably Robin Lakoff, who wrote a book called Language in Women's Place, and really, opened the door to criticize how gender permeates everything from the most like minuscule morphemes to the broadest categories of conversation. I love when I'm in a group of people who like understand me when I say something like morpheme.
Hang out with us, Amanda.
I know. I was just explaining earlier that I went to the museum for the first time a month ago, and I was moved to tears, actually. I was like, my cult. Sorry, we're talking about word salad today. But yeah, and that formative book by Robin Lakoff was really like, it set the stage for what is now this pretty robust field of study. But there were a lot of like problematic suggestions made in that book about, like, well, women hedge their speech using, more terms like, and well, and just, and actually than men do. And when I say women and men, I'm just talking about anybody who moves through the world as a woman or a man. I'm not talking about like cis, trans, non-binary. I'm talking about people who move through the world as women and men. But I did try to take the most spectrumy and intersectional approach to gender in this book as I could. But yeah, Robin Lakoff would make these sort of very binary claims like women hedge more in their speech because they've been conditioned to be insecure and deferent and dainty. And so they use these hedges to sort of like apologize for themselves when they talk. And then later over the decades, as this field became more sophisticated, people started to conduct empirical studies that revealed like, actually, there are so many different types of hedges that can serve so many different purposes depending on the context and the conversation. And actually, men use a whole hell of a lot of hedges too. It's just that we're not so attuned to them because there's this default maleness concept, in particular, when a white man speaks, his speech is not under a microscope the same way that the more marginalized a person is, the more we're critiquing every element of their speech. But men use hedges all over the place. And actually, women use hedges to assert authority way more than men do. And it's the men who oftentimes use them to apologize. So it's been an ever evolving, ever changing field of study since that time. And we have so much further to go. And I'll also say that in the years since this book came out, one of my favorite reactions is when someone will reach out to me and let me know that, they wanted to study linguistics, but they never thought they would be able to pursue a career in it. They didn't want to pursue academia, or their family didn't want them to pursue academia or something. And they're like, but this book inspired me that like I could sort of like carve my own path and come up with like a way to explore linguistics, if not professionally, then just like in life or in my spare time. And some of my readers have gone on to, be like the resident linguist at a tech company, or have pursued like a linguistics position at a nonprofit, or have, brought a linguistics lens to whatever role that they're doing, whether it's in like diversity, equity, inclusion, or anything else. And that's really cool.
So let's break it down a little bit, because language and gender is so huge as a topic. There's, how people use language to express gender. There's how gender impacts how a person talks and how that is received. And those obviously overlap enormously, but they're not all exactly the same thing. So I want to start by talking about expressing gender, because you quote or invent this great line, in terms of insults. If you want to insult a woman, call her a prostitute. And if you want to insult a man, call him a woman. And go through the history of several pejorative terms, or even just sex descriptive terms, and how some of them have become sanitized when they were originally insulting, and some of them have become insulting when they were originally benign. Let's talk about that a little bit, that pattern. You have fancier words for that, amelioration and pejoration.
Yes. Down. Yeah, I decided to open the book. This was not originally the first chapter in the book. It's a chapter breaking down gendered insults over the course of history, charting the patterns of semantic change with regard to terms that reference femininity versus masculinity. And it opens with this line: if you want to insult a woman, if you want to insult what is it? If you want to insult a woman, call her a prostitute. If you want to insult a man, call him a woman. And I decided to open, not the whole book, because there is a chapter 0, which is kind of like an intro, but I decided to effectively open the book with that line because I read somewhere that books never anymore open with like a big pronouncement like they used to in novels. Like it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Like books never do that anymore. They start off like more subtly or more coquettishly. And I'm like, I'm going for it. Like I'm opening with like a big sweeping pronouncement. And so I opened with that. I'm glad I did because it sticks out to people. And yeah, and I also thought it was a splashy subject to open with because it's quite taboo. Like one of the most fun things about writing about language and gender is that it sort of gives you like carte blanche permission to use as many 4-letter profanities as you want. It's like, no, I'm not genuinely invoking terms like, forgive me, cunt. I am dispassionately critiquing the etymology and semantic change of this word. And that's fun for a sailor-mouthed language lover such as I. But yeah, the book sort of talks about how, you know, if you look, there is first of all just a much larger wealth of slang terms and, you know, everyday English terms that are insulting and that reference femininity, that are either directed at women or describe femininity than there are for men. There just are. There's studies have been done that indicate that there's just this robust canon of female-themed insults and relatively few for men. And it's like, what's the deal with that? Well, the deal is that language, you know, reflects or you know, a certain population's position in society. And it just so happens that like every word the English language has ever offered to describe or reference a woman has at some point become insulting, in large part landing in a sexual slur. And you can look at minimal pairs of terms referencing femininity and terms referencing masculinity to show these two trajectories. So when a word starts out with a positive or neutral meaning and ends up having a negative meaning, that's called pejoration. And the opposite process, when a word starts out with a negative or neutral meaning and ends up a positive, that's called amelioration. So you can see pejoration in many more terms for women. If you look at the minimal pairs, master and mistress, these terms a few hundred years ago just meant female and male heads of household, but mistress pejorated over time to come to mean the head of a brothel, a mistress, while master ameliorated over time to come to mean the expert of a craft. Master chef is what that show is called. Default maleness, again, even a woman chef is a master chef, not a mistress chef, but I would watch that show. I make that joke in the book. I remember it. And and another minimal pair that I often talk about is buddy and sissy. So again, a few centuries ago, buddy and sissy were just synonyms for brother and sister. Buddy ameliorated to mean a pal, a close friend. Sissy pejorated to come to mean an overly effeminate, weak man who, God forbid, reminds you of a woman. So there have even been times when in the past, the word slut was not even exclusive to women, and it just meant a sort of slovenly person, someone who's sloppy and dirty. And now, of course, it means a contemptibly promiscuous woman. And that is the trajectory of so many words. And that can be quite a spiritually upsetting pattern to notice and to reckon with and to analyze. But toward the end of that chapter, I also talk about reclamation and how.
Now let's talk about that a little bit, because I love that you, because I in my spare time write suffrage history, so I love that you started with the term suffragette as an excellent example of reclamation.
Yes, I mean, for me, the most victorious example of a gendered or sexual slur being reclaimed from recent history is queer. You know, like, I remember when I was writing Word Slut, my grandfather was still alive, bless him. He was like so open-minded and such a scholar, and he never got to read the book. But I remember sitting at dinner with him and he was like, it's so wild. Like, I'm hearing the word queer. It was 2017. He was like, I'm hearing the word queer used not as an insult. I'm like, I know, right? He's like, in my day, that was, you know, that was a really insulting, sort of flagrant, taboo slur for homosexuals, mostly men, I think. And he's like, now people are tossing it around right and left with smiles on their faces and being like, I'm queer. And it's true, and not everybody alive today is comfortable with queer. Not everybody thinks like it's an unproblematic fave of a term, and that's okay, because the path to reclamation is not smooth, and we all have our individual relationships with different words, slurs, and otherwise, depending on our own background, our own experiences, and our own relationship to those terms. But in large part, queer is like the one term that I really use and feel like I embody, that once meant something hideous. I mean, to like make another linguistic comparison, it's like as amazing to me as like Hebrew being brought back from the dead. It's like, it's hard for people who grew up in my grandfather's era, who only knew that term to be really abusive, to now see it like written across, you know, people's chests at Pride. You know, dyke is another term that's been reclaimed by the in-group. Obviously, like outsiders, it's trickier to use dyke in conversation, and that's okay, and we'll see what happens. But basically, like across the board, language change and cultural change go hand in hand. And so, you know, as long as certain sex and gender identities are taboo or contemptible or not fully accepted, so too will the language, and the language will be used abusively. And this is true beyond gender. But I think it's says something beautiful about our culture and how far we've come over the past few decades, that like people who are not particularly gender educated know queer as a positive term, and kids growing up now will never know the abusive meaning. So yeah, there's optimism in the book.
Well, this brings up an issue I really am eager to discuss with you, because so much of the structure that feminists want to reclaim in language is this power struggle, right? That men, particularly white men, particularly wealthy white men, have dictated the terms of so many things for so long. The power structure in language is less clear, right? It's a little more democratic, and young women have driven language change for hundreds of years. We at Planet Word are very descriptivist, not prescriptivist. Like the change in language is a-okay with us, and
inevitable.
And inevitable. So it might as well, you know, you can either like it or not like it, but it's going to happen. And that is, especially in an internet age, not necessarily tied to traditional structures of power. Right. So these two things are sort of true at the same time, that we all have the power to change language, and yet language continues to hold these very traditional, rich white male standards.
Yes. I mean, the struggle for meaning is a grassroots campaign. Linguist Deborah Cameron said that. And so people can like hem and haw. What is that phrase? People can complain all they want, that particularly grammar is changing on them, because they think it's like a bastardization of the English language. I cannot tell you how many times I not so much anymore, but heard when I was writing Word Slut that singular they was a bastardization of the English language. I'm like, babe, you use singular they all the time and you don't even notice it. Someone left their umbrella under the table. Not to mention thou used to be the second person singular and you was the plural, and then you extended to the singular meaning. So this isn't the first time we've seen that, but alas. People freak out because when language changes, it's a sign of social change. It's a sign of younger generations rising up and reclaiming power. When people sense the grounds of linguistic change quaking beneath them, they sort of dig their heels in and they're like, no, we need to preserve. And in France, for example, like there is literally, as many people attending probably know, l'Académie Française, there is like a literal grammar police, like an official body that tries to make sure that French people don't say le weekend, or don't use like English loanwords or whatever. And, you know, they can protect people with top-down power can attempt to protect the dictionaries and grammar guides all they want, but language is going to change and reflect, the youth and the generations who are inventing the slang and the grammar constructions, no matter what happens. So You know, you can either think like a pedant or you can think like a linguist. And, you know, we all, even I, you know, I'm like, I was 25 when I started writing word slut. I felt like a spring chicken. Now I'm 30. I still feel very young, but I'm not the youngest generation making stuff anymore. You know, like Gen Z is defining the world from the bottom up now. And I'll come across a term now and again. And sometimes my impulse is to be like, ugh, these kids. But then you're like, no, I'm curious. I want to know. I want to know. Not like I want to know because I necessarily want to use it, but I want to know because I want to know what these terms are saying about our culture right now. I want to know where we're going. And if you want to know what language is going to sound like in 10 years, don't listen to a grammarian, like a, you know, cis white grammarian working at Webster's, bless lexicographers, bless them. But like, don't listen to that guy. Listen to like a Black young woman on the internet. Like, that's where language is going. And it is just consistently true that like people with marginalized gender and race identities tend to be the ones who are most inventive with language, because language for these communities is so often like their one real material power tool, and in a culture that does not give them a ton of others, of other power tools. And that's something that's really amazing about language. But at the same time, yeah, we are living under patriarchy and white supremacy. And so there will be these attitudes of like, no, you're ruining English. But it's like, nah, we're inventing
You're Englishing wrong. Yeah, I mean, it's, again, I'm afraid I did not define our terms, and I apologize for that. I'm hoping our audience knows what descriptivist and prescriptivist mean. You know, for instance, at Planet Word, we describe language. We describe all the wonderful ways people use language. We stand in awe of how incredibly creative English speakers can be. Prescriptivists want to tell you how to use the language and insist that there is, in fact, one proper way to do that. But I never thought of that as gendered before. I never thought of prescriptivism as sexist specifically.
Certainly sexist, classist, racist. I mean, think of the people who wrote the grammar guides.
Well, classist for sure. That's obvious.
Yeah,
but yeah. I hadn't thought of it in terms of gender.
For sure, because, you know, those top-down language institutions, they were, you know, owned and operated by these white guys. And so that's, of course, going to be who's defined our language from the top down. But again, like, language is a grassroots movement and art piece, and it will move along its merry way and faster than ever because of the internet, certainly.
In terms of how gender dictates how speech is perceived, and you touched on this a bit with upspeak and hedging and using like, and people seeing that as some speech patterns that need to be corrected, that they skew feminine, they make women look less assured, and that if women want to be taken more seriously or have more authority, they need to sound more like men and purge those linguistic habits from their speech. What's the counter argument to that? Why wouldn't you get rid of all those likes and ums and upspeaks?
Yeah. Well, our perception of a person's speech has very little to do with the speech itself, and very much to do with our preconceptions of the speaker. There are a couple pages in Word Slut actually that I'm happy to read, which come in defense of the word like. This tends to be a crowd pleaser. Let me just grab a copy of Word Slut, because
sure.
I think these couple pages tend to sit well with people, because yeah, we think of like as this sort of hideous stain on the fabric of English. It's like, Valley Girls, stop using like every other word. But actually, like is one of my favorite words, and I'm now gonna explain why. Okay, I have so many copies of Cultish up there, and I have only one little word left.
Hold it up, by the way, because I have a galley, so there we go. That's the book. You can buy it on our bookshop.org link.
And I didn't even mean to wear yellow, but I own so much yellow. I came to do authors look like their books, like owners look like their dogs? I think so. Okay.
I mean, then the pressure's on to have a really well-designed book, right?
Well,
you have to dress like it forever.
Regardless. But yeah, I started dressing 70s to promote Cultish, and I wore all yellow. I get very into it. Anyway, okay, this comes from a chapter in the book called Women Didn't Ruin the English Language, They Invented It. And this was the first chapter in the book that I wrote. Okay. Despite the words detractors, is in fact extremely useful and versatile. Alexandra Darcy, Canadian linguist at the University of Victoria, has dedicated much of her research to identifying and understanding the many functions of like. Darcy ebulliently describes her work for UVic's YouTube channel. Like is a little word that we really, really don't like at all, and we want to blame young girls who we think are destroying the language, she explains. But the truth is that like has been a part of the English language for more than 200 years. We can find speakers today in their 70s, 80s, and 90s around little villages in the United Kingdom, for example, Darcy says with a smile, who use like in many of the same ways that young girls today are using it. According to Darcy, there are 6 completely distinct forms of the word like. The 2 oldest types in English are the adjective like and the verb like. In the sentence, I like your suit, it makes you look like James Bond. The first like is a verb, and the second is an adjective, and even the crabbiest English speakers are fine with both. Today, these 2 likes sound exactly the same, so most people don't even notice that they're different words with separate histories. They're homonyms, just how the noun watch, meaning the timepiece on your wrist, and the verb watch, meaning what you do with your eyes when you turn on the TV, are homonyms. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the verb like comes from the Old English term Lycian, and the adjective comes from the Old English lich. The 2 converged at some point over the last 800 or so years, giving us lots of time to get used to them. But 4 new likes developed much more recently than that. And Darcy says that these are all separate words with distinct uses as well. Only 2 of these likes are used more frequently by women, and only one of them is thought to have been masterminded by young Southern California females, aka Valley Girls, in the 1990s. That one would be the quotative like, which you hear in, I was like, I want to see the movie Superwoman. As lampooned as it is, pragmatically speaking, this like is one of my favorites because it allows you to tell a story, to relay something that happened without having to quote the interaction verbatim. For example, in the sentence, my boss was like, I need those papers by Monday. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? You're not repeating what you truly said, but instead using like to convey what you wanted to say or how you felt in the interaction. Thanks, Valley Girls. This very useful quotative like continues to explode in common usage. The other like that women tend to use more frequently is categorized as a discourse marker and can be found in contexts such as, like, this suit isn't even new. A discourse marker, sometimes called a filler word, is a type of phrase that can help a person connect, organize, or express a certain attitude with their speech. Other discourse markers include the hedges we learned about in the last chapter, like just, you know, and actually. There are 2 last forms of like. One is an adverb, which is used to approximate something, as in the sentence, I bought this suit like 5 years ago. As of the 1970s, this like has largely replaced the approximate adverb about in casual conversation, and it has always been used equally among men and women, so it isn't hated as much. And last, there's the discourse particle like, which we hear in, I think this suit is like my favorite possession. This like is similar to the discourse marker, except that it's not used in quite the same way syntactically or semantically. Plus, dudes use it just as much as women do. Darcy doesn't know quite why this is, though they're almost never ridiculed for it. Objectively, we can see that using 1, 2, or all of these different likes in the same sentence isn't inherently bad. As a matter of fact, some studies have demonstrated that speech lacking in likes and you knows can sound too careful, robotic, or unfriendly. So the next time someone accuses you of saying like too much, feel free to ask them, oh really? Which kind? Because Darcy says that ordinary speakers tend to buy into the Valley Girl stereotype so hardcore blaming young women for all of these likes simply because they don't notice the differences among them. Oh, word slut. What a cute book it is.
Well, I think not only is that passage really instructive and interesting, I think it does give people a taste of this is a well-researched, linguistic book, but it is written in this very conversational tone that does make it extremely accessible. And I think that this notion of punctuating grammar police snobbery is something you clearly take enormous delight in, both in the book and evidently in your life.
It's my life. Listen to this. Listen to this story. Listen to this. I have so many stories about at times when I've invoked this sort of smugness, but smug with a smile in real life. And it's just been so satisfying. I was dating someone while I was writing this book who went to Harvard, because they always bring it up. And we were texting back and forth. I don't know. And I wasn't paying attention. I was texting and I spelled a there wrong. I swapped a there. I meant THERE and I accidentally said THEIR, something like that. And Mr. Harvard texted back and he was like, for a linguist, I would expect you to know the difference between THEIR. Oh no, he goes, for a linguist, I would expect you to have better grammar. That's what he said. And I was like, I responded right away and I was like, well, as a linguist, I know that mistaking THEIR for THERE is actually an orthographical error. It's spelling, not grammar. And as someone who went to Harvard, I would expect you to know the difference.
Yeah, Amanda.
It's spelling, not grammar. That was fun. Do I endorse behavior like that? Yes. But it is fun to sort of cheekily probe people about their pedantry, because pedantry is prejudice, really. It's privilege, it's exploited privilege. It's low-hanging fruit. So when people, on Twitter or social media or wherever else will critique a really hideous political argument, say, by saying like, well, you can't even spell insert thing here. It's like, you missed the point. We love that gotcha feeling of catching someone in a grammar or spelling infraction, but there's so much going on there, and it's not the smartest way to approach communication or the most generous way. We're talking about prescriptivism versus descriptivism. It's like the smartest people I know who are linguists are interested not in the way language should work, but in the way it does work. And that's a much more delightful position to take.
Yeah, I mean, you have a line that might as well be the motto of Planet Word, that in the wrong hands, speech can be used as a weapon, but in the right ones, it can change the world. And right? I know, it's
sweet.
But the reason it's so powerful is because we all get to use it the way we want to use it.
Yeah, we all get to define the world on our own terms. And I'm guiding a sort of linguistics themed workshop at a summer camp for trans youth in a couple of weekends called like a gender magic workshop. And sorry, I don't know if this is like off topic, but not really. But I'm excited to do it myself because I'm gonna invite us all to like invent our own gender magic new terms. Like what's a gender experience that you have that for which there exists no word? Or like, what's a gender neutral term for gendered words in English that you wish existed? And let's invent it. Let's come up with it. Use it with your friends. Use it on the internet. Write a song about it. Put it on TikTok. Maybe it'll go viral and in 10 years, everybody will use it. That sounds delusional, but like that could happen.
That could. It absolutely could. We have a bunch of really interesting questions from the audience. Somebody writes, why do you think people replace the word female with the word woman? For example, woman president instead of female president.
I have a whole chapter on that very thing.
Yes, you do.
It's a whole debacle debate. I mean, there are like memes that circulate on social media about how like, it's a red flag when a man uses female as a noun to refer to women. And I think the creepiness in that is that it feels anatomical, like it feels like animal taxonomy. You would never describe, my parents are research scientists, they study fruit flies. They would describe their fruit flies as females, not women. There is something like
dehumanizing
of the body when you say female, as if like females are crazy or whatever. It's like by the very nature, first of all, yeah, it suggests that by the very nature of a uterus, one is crazy or something. And yeah, I think, you know, also what we're hearing is more default maleness, because you don't hear man president because it's a default male profession in this culture, and around the world, I suspect, because if there are any matriarchies left, I doubt they have been civilized, if you will. So yeah, I think, you know, we put woman or female in front of professions that are default male, and whether you put female or woman first is personal. Whether you use it at all is personal. Some people like it because when you say woman scientist, it sort of highlights the person's, you know, that the person like rose above the odds and became a scientist despite patriarchy's odds against them. And then some people are like, why would we need to call out a woman's gender in a context when we wouldn't call out a man's? So it's an interesting question. If someone were to, if I were in mixed company, if you will, and someone were like, and this is Billy Bob Jones, who's a writer and blah, blah, blah. And this is Amanda Montell, a woman writer. And I would be like, but then again, I'd be like, yeah, sure. If that's inspiring to someone, like, yeah, I'm a feminist writer, I'm a woman writer, then fine. I don't feel strongly about it, but a lot of people do. And there is no right or wrong answer, I don't think, right now.
Like so much else. Somebody asks, is there linguistic terminology for the act of using Latinx or WOMXN, etc.? Thank you, excellent event, this person asks.
Thank you so much. Is there, oh, that's a great question. Is there a particular term for gender neutralizing an existing gendered term? That woman with an X thing or folks with an X thing is very contentious, because in certain, in you know, spaces that I'm in where, you know, we critique gender, we analyze gender, we talk about gender, we celebrate gender, whatever, a question has arisen, why do we need to put an X in the, I suppose because the word man is in woman or men is in woman, and we were like, no, but then I think some people put that X in there because X is like the gender neutral symbol, say on a driver's license. And so woman including X could also include non-binary femmes, but then it's like, but a woman is just anybody who is a woman. Like, why do we need to spell it differently? I think everybody defines it slightly differently depending on their interpretation, depending on the context.
Yeah, I think that is slightly different from the Latinx example. And you talk about that in the book, that the languages that have gendered nouns, finding a gender neutral alternative is
absolutely. There are movements in gendered languages all over the world, from Hebrew to French to Spanish, to navigate gender neutrality in a grammatically gendered language, and putting an X on the end of Latin instead of saying Latino or Latina is a bid for gender neutrality in that language. And everybody feels differently about it. I mean, again, from my understanding at this time, the Latinx, I suppose I'm going to use it now, folks that I know personally don't care for it because X, that suffix doesn't flow fluidly in Spanish. Like, that's not a suffix you would hear in Spanish. So I think like we're workshopping it, right? I mean, we not like, I'm not workshopping it myself, but like we as a culture are sort of workshopping gender neutrality in these grammatically gendered languages. I mean, no one could predict that singular they would become sort of like the most popular gender neutral singular pronoun, because
there were other contenders. Yeah,
there were other contenders. So like TBD, and how cool is that? And it's going to be messy in the meantime, and people are going to fight, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's what language change in real time is. So we have a couple of questions that are a little bit at odds with each other, which I really appreciate. This is why I love our audience. So we've talked about young people as driving linguistic change, and how you as an elderly 30-year-old find that Gen Z is innovating in a way that you're not necessarily hip to. And so somebody asks, I'd love, and I say that as somebody who is solidly Gen X. Someone says, I'd love to hear what new to you Gen Z terms have sparked interest for you recently. And then at the same time, we've had a couple of people say, is ageism the last ism that's acceptable? Is this youth obsessed culture that is allowing ageist language to be okay?
I think so. I mean, did anybody attending watch that show, The Chair, about the Netflix show about, I cannot believe the show got made, but it's literally like a dramedy about a prestigious university's English department. It's
the one with Sandra Oh?
Yeah. That premise sounds almost as boring as a book about feminist sociolinguistics. Here I am roasting myself. Anyway, I liked the show, watching it as a then 29-year-old. But my mom, who works in academia, watched it. And my mom is not that old, but my mom was like, this show is so ageist. And it was a show that was really trying to comment on inclusivity and really trying to take an inclusive stance. But people above the age of 40 were just getting dragged through the show. Like, we're really being like singularly blamed based on their age and their age alone. And you can find problematic people on university campuses of every daggone age, as long as they're in a position of power. So yeah, I think there is something to that ageism is the last acceptable ism. But I also think it's like we're navigating right now in this era, like who to blame for what? Like who should be held responsible for various oppressions? And I think it's easy, and a lot of people can agree, for valid reasons and biased ones, to hold older generations accountable for a lot of oppressions. And sometimes that accountability is like a little bit undue, and it's not even accountability at that point. It is just prejudice. Like we do live in this very youth-centric culture, and I would be interested if like ageist slang is emerging in the same way in like collectivist cultures that value their elderly. I don't know.
Interesting thought. Yeah. Although at the same time, every generation had its chance to be the youth language innovators, and some of those terms have stuck. Yeah. We all say cool.
We all say freaking out. We forget that's just 70s slang. That's 70s slang that like people my mom's age made up, or my dad's age. My parents are kind of different in age. People in between my mom's and dad's ages made up. And their parents were like, oh, these kids freaking out. What does that mean? But it filled a lexical gap in the language. And that's why slang sticks at the end of the day, when it fills a lexical gap, when there was no term for that thing before. The reason why synonyms for cool revolve in and out, like, what am I saying? Yeah, come in and out so fast. There's such turnover, is because like we already have a word for cool, and it's cool. There's not a lexical gap there. We can describe a cool experience with the word cool. And there's always going to be like a new cool way to say cool, but we already have cool. So it's like lit, whatever. Like it'll all, oh my God, I'm so old. Oh my God. No, I hate it when I hear it like that. Is there but sorry, the original question, but yes, when a term fills a lexical gap, then oftentimes it winds up like taking a seat at the table of mainstream English. Like I think mansplain will be here for a good long while because great portmanteau, we didn't have a word for that before. And that slang was not necessarily, well, I don't know how old the person was who invented that, but it was inspired by Rebecca Solnit. Is there a Gen Z term that has been interesting to me recently? I don't know if this is recent, but like a few years ago when simp started to become very popular on TikTok, simp meaning a man who contemptibly is like overly reverent towards and complimentary towards women. Like God forbid men like compliment women in a really like sweet, earnest way. This term, like most of our best slang, originated in African American vernacular English, became popular, was kind of bastardized, took on a life of its own once it got to the internet. And I thought like, oh, you know, Gen Z, that's like a more inclusive generation gender-wise than millennials. Like I wonder how that's going to manifest in slang. And then amid all that, we have this like gendered insult for a man who is like, yeah, heaven forbid, nice to women. It's like, no, don't compliment women. But at the same time, simp is, first of all, softer phonetically, but also softer semantically than like pussy. No, it's not softer phonetically than pussy. It is softer. It is softer.
Same sounds, yeah.
Phonetically than I'm not gonna say like some really offensive term right now, but like it's not maybe quite as bad as some gendered insults for men that reference femininity that we've heard in the past. So maybe like even though this gendered insult emerged among the youth in a way that was kind of disappointing, we're still on the right path. But I love Gen Z. I try to keep tabs
on the youths. We haven't talked about phonetics at all. You talked about slang sticks when it fills a lexical gap, but it also has to sound a certain way, or at least the most successful examples are fun to say in a way that feels very universal.
Yeah, in Wordlet, I have a whole chapter on cursing because I love cursing, obviously. And I love the phonosymbolism of certain words just like feel good in the mouth. But yeah, consistently, we love a plosive consonant. And if a word is short, monosyllabic, plosive, boob, dude, fuck, we love it. We embrace it. I mean, yeah, like really, really like ba ba da da, like these are the first sounds we make when we babble. We love them.
Somebody asks, what do you think of the phenomenon of hashtags? What does it say about our language or culture?
I think hashtags are another sort of grassroots language campaign. I think hashtags are also like they're something to assemble around. They're a linguistic symbol of community, for better and for worse. I talk about that more in Cultish. But yeah, I think hashtags can be really powerful in, assembling people around a collective mission, obviously.
You know, having just talked about phonetics, written slang, true internet slang, things that people don't necessarily say out loud or weren't coined for people to say out loud, is a whole linguistic branch that is changing language as well.
Oh yeah, that's Gretchen McCulloch's book.
Yes, who has joined us here at Planet Word.
I interviewed her for Wordslut, actually. There are like a couple quotes of hers in there. Internet like pwned, like people don't say, but sometimes I will, and my friends and I will pronounce like only typable words out loud, and it's funny every time. Sometimes people make fun of me because I'll be like Lamau, that's how I pronounce LMAO. Like laughing my ass off. I'll be like Lamau.
Entertaining yourself. So somebody says, my favorite game to play with my grandparents is to look up a list of Gen Z slang and have them guess the meanings.
So fun. That's so fun. It's like generational Fictionary.
Exactly. That's such a great idea.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that.
And this is why I love our audience. So we are at the end of our time. I want to ask, just because we've talked to you already about cultish and about word slut, what are you working on?
Oh my God, I'm about to return to it the second we get off this. I'm disappointed to say that it's not a language book specifically, but it is written by me, which means it's always going to have a language lens. And I don't know if you know this, but books are written using language. So there's
no way.
Yeah, I know. You heard it here. So I'm playing with language in a different way right now. I'm working on a book called The Age of Magical Overthinking. The subtitle is Notes on Modern Irrationality. And every chapter is sort of themed around a different cognitive bias. And I explore how that cognitive bias shows up in the information age and how we can sort of fight back against the follies and embrace the unexpected joys of these necessary delusions, if you will.
Oh, we will keep an eye out for it. Amanda Montel, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, as always.
And thank you to the audience and to our members, and especially to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation for supporting this series, Language And I hope we will see you all in the museum soon or on another virtual program. Good night.